Sir Richard noticed Lucy near Lady Harriet and said, "She is a companion, Harriet, not family." Lady Harriet reached for her. Lucy was already stepping back. That was the correct thing. Edward Yorke, Earl of Alderwick, said from the far end of the room, "Miss Marsh stays." Everyone turned. The painter had arranged the Yorkes in order of importance, and that arrangement had left no space for Lucy Marsh. She stood near the window with Lady Harriet's shawl over her arm and a half-empty cup of cooling tea, and now the painter was adjusting his composition to include her, and Sir Richard was looking at her the way he had been looking at the household silver all week, with the patience of a man assessing whether anything needed to be relocated. Sir Richard lifted his chin and objected, "It is a family portrait, Edward." Edward's voice was even and unhurried when he answered, "It is a portrait of this household. If we remove the person my aunt cannot manage without, the composition will be rather inaccurate." The painter cleared his throat and made no comment whatsoever. Lady Harriet lowered her hand. It had come out the moment Sir Richard spoke, the way it always did when something disturbed her. Her expression was something between gratitude and apology. Lucy met neither of their eyes. She returned to the position the painter now indicated, set her cup down on a side table, and fixed her attention on the middle distance. She was not certain she was glad he had done it. She had spent 12 years of service becoming invisible. It was hard work becoming invisible. It required constant attention. The Earl had undone it in 8 words. She found him in the corridor afterward, still carrying Lady Harriet's shawl. She had stopped partway to the staircase. Edward had turned from the drawing-room door. He had the kind of attention that did not move quickly, dark eyes, a careful, unhurried focus. She shifted Lady Harriet's shawl higher in her arms and said, "You did not need to do that." Edward stayed by the drawing-room door, his attention still on her as he asked, "Is that a common occurrence?" The portrait was a family portrait, she told him. Sir Richard was not incorrect. He remained where he was in the doorway, his attention fixed on her rather than on her answer, and said, "That is not what I asked." She acknowledged, after a moment, that it was not uncommon. He studied her, not with pity, which she would have found insufferable, but with something more like interest, and observed, "My aunt appears to depend upon you considerably." Lucy tightened her hold on the shawl before answering, "She has been unwell." He glanced once toward the drawing-room, then back to her, and asked, "I find I need to understand the household more thoroughly than I currently do. Would you be willing to assist me?" She was not certain she had agreed to anything. She had the uneasy sense she had. She returned the shawl to Lady Harriet that evening and said nothing more about the portrait. He was in the breakfast-room the following morning with a stack of household ledgers that suggested either a very early start or no sleep at all. A letter had been folded between the pages of a book on the sideboard. 2 more were tucked inside a volume on the window seat, a history of agricultural improvements, of all things. Lucy set her own notes on the table and said nothing about this. Edward ran a finger down the wages column, frowning as he read aloud. According to this, 2 housemaids are being paid for work that could reasonably be managed by one. A reduction would... Lucy turned the ledger back toward him and explained, "That column includes the wages of a former maid who married and left Alderwick last spring. Lady Harriet continued the payment for 3 months to help her establish her household. The figure was never adjusted." A silence. He checked. She was right. He looked up from the ledger and asked, "How long have you managed the correspondence and accounts?" Lucy kept one hand on her own notes as she answered, "Lady Harriet manages her own affairs. I have assisted her when her health made it difficult." Lady Harriet appeared in the doorway in her dressing gown and settled the question with characteristic efficiency. "She has run this household for 8 months, Edward, and done it rather better than I did before my illness." Edward set the ledger straight on the table and said, "Then I would be grateful if you would continue to assist me until my aunt has recovered fully." It was a practical arrangement. Lucy reminded herself of this. It was also the first time in her professional life that a person with authority over her circumstances had asked rather than informed. She crossed to the sideboard, collected the scattered correspondence from between the book pages, and set it in front of him, adding, "Your filing system may require some attention." He almost smiled when he replied, "I will take that under consideration." After that, Lucy began leaving the tenant correspondence beside Edward's breakfast plate, along with the household accounts. By the end of the week, he could follow Alderwick's ledgers, not just as figures, but as history, which maid had married and left, which tenant was overdue on a repair, which of Lady Harriet's charitable arrangements had drifted during the illness. One morning, without particular ceremony, he looked up from the accounts and asked whether she would accompany him to the East cottages. She had the tenant notes from the past 8 months. He had the estate maps. He needed both. The road from the hall was a half-mile of once well-maintained gravel that now required attention the household accounts had not yet planned for. Edward walked it rather than riding. He stopped at each cottage. He knew the tenants by name, not just the family names, but the given names, the children's names, the name of the dog at the gate of the 3rd cottage, who had apparently been there since before the previous Earl's time. The older tenants called him Mr. Edward without ceremony, which he accepted without correction. At the 4th cottage, an elderly woman, not a current tenant, but a former Alderwick housemaid, living now with her daughter's family, had been ill for a week and could not reach the village market. Edward spoke with her at the door for a few minutes and then turned back toward the estate to arrange for supplies to be sent. Lucy had already written down what the woman said she needed. He noticed and said nothing, and she did not explain herself. They had reached the far edge of the grounds, where 2 estate workers were stacking timber beneath the overhang of the old groundskeeper's outbuilding, loose lengths that had been waiting since autumn for proper sheltering. The sky changed without ceremony, the way it always did at Alderwick, a grey closing over and then rain, immediate and decisive. The timber was not yet fully covered. All 4 of them moved without discussion. For the next quarter hour they worked under a sky that had no patience for standing still. Edward did not position himself apart from it and direct. He lifted and stacked alongside the workers, coat off, sleeves rolled, moving the heavier pieces with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had spent years at this kind of work before he had a title. Lucy had seen plenty of gentlemen who employed their authority as a reason to stand at a distance. She had not seen many who did not. By the time the worst of it was handled, they were both soaked and dishevelled, and Lucy had at some point called him Edward. Not my lord, not sir, his name. He had answered immediately, without any pause at all. Afterward, they stood under the overhang while the rain ran off the roof in steady streams, and the estate workers moved the last of the timber under cover. Lucy drew breath to correct herself. Edward kept his attention on the rain as he said, "I think the name has rather established itself over the course of the afternoon. Reversing it now would seem a particular waste." The corner of her mouth moved before she could prevent it. The quiet between them had changed into something with no comfortable name. She did not apologize. He did not remark upon it again. They walked back to the hall in the rain without resolving what to call each other, and neither of them managed to return entirely to formality again. They came back through the servants' entrance in the east wing, and the footmen received their coats without comment. In the days that followed, their working exchanges remained slightly less formal. Nobody addressed this directly. Lady Harriet, who had been watching from her sitting-room chair, said nothing, and sent word to the kitchen about the Copley dinner she had been planning for a fortnight. Servants carried extra chairs into the drawing-room. The cook received extended instructions. Lucy reviewed the menu, confirmed the arrangements in the dining room, and made certain the flowers were placed where Lady Harriet would want them before the Copley's carriage came up the drive. Mr. Thomas Copley was a substantial gentleman of considerable property, and his daughter Sophia was everything Edward's family had been quietly hoping for. Intelligent, composed, well-connected, pleasant to sit beside at table, neither silly nor scheming. Sophia Copley, Lucy decided within the first quarter hour, was someone she could have genuinely liked under different circumstances. That made it considerably harder. Edward was perfectly attentive to both Copleys. He asked Sophia's opinion on subjects that required an opinion, and listened to Mr. Copley's views on subjects that required listening. There was nothing in his behavior toward Sophia that could have been called insufficient. But 3 times during dinner he turned slightly in his chair without appearing to notice he was doing it. Not toward Sophia. The turn was reflexive, the movement of a man who expects to find something at his left shoulder, a face he is accustomed to finding there, a person whose response he is already forming a question for. Lucy was not at his left shoulder. She was near the far end of the table, in the position appropriate to her station. The 3rd time it happened, she looked up and found Sophia Copley watching Edward's small, unconscious turn with an expression of quiet, courteous intelligence. Then Sophia's gaze moved to Lucy. Lucy returned to her soup. She understood, clearly and without any comfort, that Edward's reliance upon her had become visible to everyone at the table, including the woman his family expected him to marry, and including Lucy herself, who had spent the past several weeks choosing not to examine it directly. Before the Copleys' carriage was called, Sophia found a quiet moment to speak with Edward. She was not wounded, and she was not angry. She had simply noticed, she told him, that his attention had been elsewhere all evening, and she had no interest in entering a marriage on those terms. She said it pleasantly and without accusation, and returned to her father. The Copleys left at 10. When Lucy had overseen the clearing away and Lady Harriet had retired, she passed the library door on her way to the stairs and found it open. Edward was at the table with a different set of ledgers, ones she had not seen before. The debt was worse than the household figures had suggested, considerably worse. She set down the page she had been holding and asked, "How long have you known?" He sat across from her, posture controlled as always, but his voice tired in a way she had not heard before. "Since I inherited. My father was more optimistic than the numbers warranted. Everyone advising me treats the situation as though a straightforward solution exists. Marry well, restore the finances, discharge the obligation, as though the question of what one might want for oneself is a luxury belonging to people who have not inherited other people's debts." Lucy's eyes stayed on the figures. After a moment, she ran a finger along the nearest column and said, "You believe they are right." He turned one of the pages over and replied, "I believe they are not wrong. I simply find I am no longer certain that duty and correctness are the same thing." Sophia Copley's name was not written anywhere in the ledger. It did not need to be. Edward pushed the ledger aside and asked, "What will you do when Lady Harriet has recovered?" Lucy kept her eyes on the accounts and answered, "Find another position." Edward left the ledger open between them and said, "You speak of it as though it is already determined." Lucy met his gaze from across the table and told him, "It generally is determined by someone else." He was watching her with that full, unhurried attention. Lucy looked at the table before her and admitted, "I have made an error, often." She kept her voice quiet and went on, "I have mistaken being necessary for belonging. They are not the same thing. Necessity ends. That is its nature. A household recovers. An employer moves away. A situation resolves. And one finds another position. I have learned to begin preparing to leave before anyone has to ask me to." She had not intended to say so much. Edward was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke, there was no self-justification in it. "I have done something similar. I have decided what is owed to everyone around me without troubling to ask what any of them actually want. I believed it was conscientiousness." After a moment he added, "It may have been a way of avoiding the question altogether." The lamp between them burned without drama. Outside, Alderwick Hall settled into the dark. The following morning, Lucy was in the breakfast-room chair before the post arrived. Edward was already there before her, as he always was. He asked her judgment on household matters and deferred on others he had previously decided alone. One morning, she came down to find the large flower arrangement. Gardenias and white narcissus, heavily scented, which she had mentioned once to Lady Harriet, gave her headaches, replaced by a simple spray of greenery with no smell at all. No one mentioned it. She looked at the new arrangement, and then at Edward, who was reading a letter and did not look up. She sat down. The correspondence joke had by then accumulated its own small history. She had by now extracted important letters from a history of the Peloponnesian Wars, a volume of sermons, 2 novels, and the book of agricultural improvements she had noticed on the very first morning. Each time she set the letters in front of him without comment. Each time the line at the corner of his mouth shifted almost imperceptibly. Once, the letter retrieved from the volume of sermons, she set it in front of him and observed that she had begun to understand his filing principles. He replied, without looking up, that the correspondence had perhaps benefited morally from the proximity. Lucy returned to her notes. By then, he had also learned to anticipate her. Without pausing his reading, he would slide the relevant book toward her side of the table. One morning, she was needed with Lady Harriet and could not come to the breakfast room at all. She heard afterward from a housemaid who mentioned it with no awareness of any significance that his lordship had asked twice whether Miss Marsh was expected. He had not asked anyone to send for her. He had looked at the empty chair twice and returned to his correspondence. Meanwhile, Lady Harriet was recovering. She began appearing downstairs before noon, then before 10. By the 3rd week, she had reclaimed correspondence Lucy had already answered, adding brief addenda in her own hand. By the 4th, she was meeting with Mrs. Palmer about the week's menus and asking after the linen count. By the 5th Sunday, Lady Harriet was well enough for church. Lucy found Lady Harriet's prayer book, arranged her cloak, and helped her downstairs. Edward handed her into the carriage. The village families were already seated when the Alderwick party arrived, and what passed through the congregation then was not for Lucy. It was the small collective readjustment of people seeing Lady Harriet return to her proper place. She moved to the family pew, accepted a nod from the vicar, and settled as though she had not been gone for 8 months, which, in the most important respects, she had not. Lucy settled into the place just behind her, and understood without anyone saying so that what Lady Harriet was reclaiming was not merely her place in church. Lucy continued to the breakfast room each morning because nothing had formally changed, but the household was bringing fewer decisions to her. The keys at her waist felt different. One morning, Lucy placed the household keys on the breakfast table and began. The linen accounts still need reviewing. The south garden wall wants attention before winter. Mrs. Palmer is reliable, but she requires specific direction for any occasion beyond the routine. Lady Harriet set her hand over the keys and said, "I have been ill, not absent." Lucy stepped back from the table, saying, "Yes, of course." That afternoon she wrote to Mrs. Drummond in Cheltenham, who had inquired 2 months ago whether Lucy would be available for a companion position in the new year. The household was quiet and respectable. The terms were clear. She would know, if she accepted, exactly where she would be 6 months hence. She left the letter on the sideboard to be posted. Edward found her in the library an hour later. The Cheltenham letter was still on the table beside her. He stayed near the door, his attention on the letter, and asked, "Lady Harriet mentioned it. Is it what you want?" She looked at the letter rather than at him before answering, "It is what is available." The space between those two answers sat in the room without either of them filling it. He did not ask her to stay. She saw him stop himself. Something careful and controlled moved through his expression, and she was not certain whether she was grateful or not. Lucy had been near the window for 10 minutes, waiting for a moment to excuse herself quietly, when Sir Richard fixed his attention on Edward and said, "You have thrown away the Copley match. The estate cannot afford it." Edward answered without raising his voice, "The estate requires careful management over time. It does not require that I select my wife by the size of her father's accounts." Sir Richard's gaze returned to Edward as he began, "Your father—" Without raising his voice, Edward replied, "My father's choices are precisely why the estate is in its current condition." The sentence was not raised. It was simply finished. Sir Richard's gaze moved to Lucy, still near the window, and he continued, "Miss Marsh has been extremely useful to Lady Harriet. No one disputes it." He paused. The same pause from the portrait sitting returned now with greater weight, and the next words landed on Lucy directly when he said, "But usefulness does not make a companion suitable to become Countess of Alderwick, and one might fairly ask whether such attentions have been encouraged." Edward turned toward Lucy, not with apology, not with the expression of a man performing rescue, with the expression of a man who had worked something out carefully and intended to say it clearly. Then he turned back to Sir Richard and said, "Miss Marsh has advised me repeatedly to consider my estate obligations. She has declined, consistently, to encourage my inclination toward her. She has accepted a position elsewhere and intends to leave this week. She gains nothing from my decision. Whatever I have chosen, I have chosen. If you wish to argue about it, argue with me." Sir Richard said nothing. Lady Harriet, in the chair by the fire, did not speak either, but she met Lucy's eyes across the room, briefly, with an expression Lucy chose not to examine too closely. Lucy excused herself from the room. She went upstairs, her breathing not entirely steady, and finished packing. The carriage was brought around in the grey of an early morning. Edward came to the courtyard and handed Lucy her written reference. She took it, read the first line, which described her judgment as sound and her practical competence as beyond question, and folded it with the care of someone keeping her hands occupied. The coachman was ready. Lucy started toward the carriage step, then paused and turned back to say, "You could ask me to stay." Edward kept his voice even when he answered, "I could. I do not think it would be right to." Lady Harriet would manage. They both knew it. Lucy said, "And the filing system." He kept his hands at his sides when he replied, will suffer, but survive. Her hand rested on the carriage frame as she asked, "Do you want me to go?" He held her gaze and answered, "No." Her answer began before she had decided how to finish it. "Then?" Edward stayed where he was and said, "I want your choice to be yours more than I want you to stay. That is the only thing I am confident is right." Lucy got into the carriage, and Alderwick Hall reduced itself to a shape in the rear window, and then disappeared around the bend in the road, and she sat with her excellent written reference on her lap and looked straight ahead. In the first weeks after Lucy left, Edward gave up his Mayfair establishment, terminated the lease, declined several invitations that would have required expenditures he had decided were unnecessary, and redirected the savings toward Alderwick's most pressing debts. He did it without consulting anyone, because there was no one whose opinion he needed. In Cheltenham, Lucy settled into Mrs. Drummond's respectable household. The duties were clear, Mrs. Drummond was entirely reasonable, and there was no ambiguity about Lucy's position or the length of her welcome. She lasted 5 weeks. The difficulty was not Mrs. Drummond. The difficulty was the chair she chose each morning at Mrs. Drummond's sitting-room table, comfortable, respectable, belonging to no shared private ritual. No one expected her in it before she arrived or noticed, especially whether she came at all. Lady Harriet's letter arrived, an invitation to a birthday gathering at Alderwick Hall. Lucy held it and understood that safe from loss was not the same thing as a life she actually wanted. She wrote to Mrs. Drummond and then to Lady Harriet. The journey back took most of a day. Lucy arrived in the grey of late afternoon, crossed the entrance hall and would have gone straight upstairs. But the drawing-room door stood open. Something on the wall caught her attention. She stopped. The portrait was there, properly framed and properly finished, and herself visible in it at Lady Harriet's left side, not a shadow in a doorway, not a figure stepping back, present and permanent in oil and canvas. She stood there longer than was probably sensible. Lady Harriet's birthday gathering was warm and slightly chaotic, because Lady Harriet's gatherings were always slightly chaotic, and Lucy was useful in the ways she was always useful, and was also welcomed and embraced and told with brisk affection that the hall had been considerably less well managed and considerably duller in her absence, and she should think carefully before trying anything like that again. When the family had gone to their rooms, she found Edward in the drawing-room, not by arrangement, simply by the ordinary logic of two people in the same house who knew each other well enough to know where the other would be. She had stopped near the portrait. He was at the far end of the room when he said, "You gave up the Cheltenham position." She confirmed that she had. Lady Harriet had not asked it of her. He moved toward the window then, not away from her, but the careful movement of a man who needed a moment to be precise. Outside, Alderwick Hall's grounds were dark and still. When he turned back from the glass, Edward asked, "What do you want? Not what is available, not what is sensible. What do you actually want your life to contain?" She had been asked this question very rarely. She took it seriously. Lucy turned toward the portrait, toward herself standing there, inarguably present, and answered from that place, "Useful work, a household where my judgment is valued rather than merely tolerated, people I love, somewhere I do not have to continually earn permission to remain." He was quiet for a moment. Then he closed some of the distance between them before asking, "Would you choose to build that life with me?" Lucy said, "The estate's finances are still in recovery. The south garden wall still needs work. The linen accounts are 3 weeks overdue." Edward answered, "Yes." Lucy added, "And you will continue to use the library as an administrative archive." Edward glanced once toward the library before admitting, Almost certainly. Lucy closed the remaining distance between them and said, "Then, yes." Lady Harriet was told before supper. The small Alderwick chapel had not been used for a private ceremony in several years, but the arrangements were straightforward. Sir Richard was informed by letter. Winter deepened. The Alderwick chapel was small, and the winter morning was pale and still when Lucy came through the door. Edward was already at the front. He had not looked up when she entered. When he did, he was still in a way that had nothing to do with composure. Lady Harriet occupied the first pew, upright and satisfied in a manner that suggested she had been waiting for precisely this for considerably longer than anyone had acknowledged. Sir Richard sat 2 rows behind, correct and contained. Several of the household staff had gathered in the rear pews in their winter coats. The aisle was short. Lucy walked it. The vows were brief. A cold, pale chapel. A few words exchanged quietly, and Edward's hands around hers, while the thin winter light moved through the windows. When it was done, Lady Harriet made a small sound she almost managed to suppress, and Sir Richard offered his correct congratulations, and that was the wedding. They came back through the hall toward the small breakfast that had been laid in the dining room. The portrait was visible as they passed through the drawing room, Lucy standing at Lady Harriet's side, present and permanent, the painter's composition now a settled fact. She went past it beside Edward without stopping. Spring light reached farther across the breakfast table now. Correspondence came in every morning, and it came to Lucy first, the letters requiring the household's attention, and she handled them at the table while Edward read the morning papers, and occasionally looked over her shoulder, and occasionally offered his opinion, and occasionally retreated behind his papers without offering any opinion at all, which she had by now learned to interpret correctly. The household keys rested at Lucy's waist now as part of the ordinary business of being mistress of Alderwick, not borrowed authority, but her own. A letter had gone missing. She found it in the volume of agricultural improvements on the sideboard, where it had apparently been residing since the previous afternoon. She crossed to the table and placed it in front of Edward without a word. He looked up from his papers, looked at the letter, looked at her. He held out his hand. She did not immediately give it back. He waited, with the patience of a man who had learned when patience was the correct response, and kept his hand where it was. She gave it back. Later, they walked out to see the east cottages in the morning light, the repaired stone wall standing solid where the old wall had been, the tenants moving about their ordinary business. Edward said something about the quality of the mortar in a tone that was entirely practical and slightly absurd, and Lucy laughed, and they continued along the road toward home. The keys moved lightly at Lucy's waist as they followed the road home, Alderwick Hall bright ahead of them in the spring morning. And that, my dukes and duchesses, was the story of Lucy Marsh, who was once told there was no place for her in a family portrait, and found a place at Alderwick that was truly her own. I hope Lucy and Edward's story has found you well. If you enjoyed spending a little time at Alderwick Hall, I would be delighted if you subscribed and joined me for the next tale. And if you would be so kind, do let me know what you thought of Lucy and Edward's story in the comments. Until we meet again, thank you most sincerely for watching.